Attachment theory has gotten a lot of attention in the past few years related to relationships, and it is an important part of understanding health and well-being. Today on Ask Dr. Gill, I want to discuss how attachment and your style of attachment can affect your health outcomes. So stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Ask Dr. Gill. I am your host, Dr. Gill Winkelman, and today on the podcast, I want to talk about attachment theory and the areas of how that can affect your mental as well as your physical health, because I think there's a fair amount of misunderstanding around attachment theory, and I'm going to get into that. Spoiler alert, there's an aspect of it that it's not fixed. It can vary based on who you're involved with. And it isn't just about how you've been raised, because I think there's a crossroads here. And what comes first, we're not quite sure. But attachment style can affect the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. In a way, it's a conversation of your childhood with your vagus nerve and cortisol levels. Let's explore what that might be and what that's about. Let's start with attachment, because attachment theory basically starts with the work in the mid-20th century of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And at its core, it's basically about how we view relationships. Are we secure? Do we trust instinctually that this person is good and they're going to bond with me? Or do we have a style of attachment where we either avoid someone or we're anxious, we're fearful that they're going to avoid us? And I mean, it's really interesting when you look at this, because clearly there's an aspect of this that could be coming up from how you've been raised. The four styles of attachment: there's secure, you feel comfortable being close with someone, and you also feel comfortable being autonomous. And if you were raised with parents who let you wander, and then also if you needed something, they were there, generally those people are secure. And I'll get to a reason why they may not be in just a minute. An anxious person is great with feeling close, but they're not so good if they're not with somebody. They can have a very strong fear of abandonment. And the avoidant is the flip side of that. They value independence. They might minimize emotions. They might dismiss other people's emotions, call other people needy. And then the disorganized, which is the fourth type, is kind of a going back and forth, longing for connection, fearing it at the same time. And there's an aspect of it where you're both avoidant and anxious. Now, the interesting thing about disorganized is that is probably most often due to trauma. Like, people who have a history of trauma might often show up with disorganized. And I don't know if there's a natural way that disorganized attachment would show up without this being a trauma case. The thing about attachment theory that I want to bring up here for a minute, because most of the books that are out about attachment theory discuss it from a standpoint of how were you raised by your parents. And what's interesting is there's been research studies that basically show some people have an attachment style that is separate from how they were raised. What we think might be happening evolutionarily is the anxious people are more in tune to the environment and, we'll say, empathic of other people. So they notice when things are wrong first. And the avoidant people are the people who will take care of themselves first. An example of this was a research study that was done where the researchers got together groups of people who they knew whether they are anxious, avoidant, or secure. and said, hey, we're having you all do a project together on a computer. And what really was going on is the researchers were creating a fake smoke smell in the room. It was the anxious people who noticed it first, and it was the avoidant people who left the room first, and then the secure people followed, and then the anxious people left. What we think, and this study has been repeated in various ways, what we think is that when there's a group situation, it is the anxious people who are the chicken littles who notice that the sky is actually falling. And the avoidant people go and find shelter. And then everyone else says, maybe we should do that too. So it's kind of an interesting piece to how all of this plays out. And absolutely, you can be having issues with attachment and have an insecure attachment style, anxious or avoidant, because of how you were raised. Absolutely. But just because you were raised a particular way doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up that particular way. The other thing I would say that's really interesting about attachment theory is that back up for a second, there's online, if you go online and do an attachment test, or you can Google it, there's several places that have these tests, and some of them are really good, by the way. What's interesting is if you think about a relationship that you have and take the test, and think about another relationship you have and take the test, there's a very good possibility that you will score differently for the attachment style. And some of these tests basically score you in a way that it gives a percentage of your 60% secure, your 20% disorganized, your 10% anxious, and your 10% avoidant, something like that. Those numbers will change if you think about different people. And part of that is how they approach relationship, right? If you're in relationship with someone who's dismissive, you might feel anxious. And it's interesting, there's a book out about this called Attached. And one of the cases that they bring up, and I've discussed this particular case with many of my colleagues, and they basically say, the person that was in the relationship was anxious and the other person was avoidant. Really, the other guy was a narcissist. And that will create anxiety if someone has a personality disorder or a mental health issue or whatever it is. That will create anxiety for someone in relation. And it was interesting because they said, well, she got involved with someone who was secure and she was fine. And it's like, well, maybe she wasn't the person that was the problem here. Maybe she was responding to the environment. So I think it's important to sort of understand that, and also understand that your attachment style can change over time. And I think, to the credit of the psychology and some of the books and the researchers out there, they talk about this, that an anxious or an avoidant person can become secure, which is really great, because I don't want this to be written in stone. And I've talked about this on my podcasts, on previous episodes of the podcast, that when we're writing the stories in our head about ourselves, we don't want to be too attached to it. And this is a great example, because if you say, hey, I'm anxious, and you recognize that there is an anxious element going on in this relationship and you want to work through it, this gives you an opportunity to talk to your partner, and they can do things, and we're going to talk about that in the second half of the show. They can do things to help calm you down. And so the story, if you will, about your anxious attachment doesn't have to be set in stone. And then eventually you can become secure. And that's the idea and the ideal with these situations. I'm going to take a quick break. And in the second half of the show, I'm going to talk about the effects on the nervous system, particularly cortisol and parasympathetic. So stay tuned. Okay, so welcome back. I'm Dr. Gil Winkelman, your host of Ask Dr. Gil, the podcast. And I just want to remind people, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me at info, at askdrgil.com, askdrgil.com. You can also go to my website, and there's a button at the top called, says schedule. Click on that. There's a form you can fill out and send me an email that way as well. And if you have a topic that you'd like to hear, let me know, because I would love to share that with you. And I want to just briefly mention the workshop I'm going to be doing on the stories we tell ourselves and how it affects our health. And there'll be more information on this, but I will be putting stuff on my website. And if you go to my website, there's a form that you can fill out to get on a mailing list, and I'll be sending information out here in the near term. Let's get back to the topic of attachment, and let's talk about how it affects our nervous system, specifically the fight, flight, freeze regulation. And each attachment style has a nervous system pattern, usually related to cortisol, which fires up or fires down the sympathetic nervous system. I've looked at different studies on this, and what's interesting is that some of the studies say different things. And I think a big part of this is that cortisol is actually really hard to measure in the body. And if any of you have ever had adrenal issues or have talked to me about adrenal issues, that when we look at, testing, the tests aren't always accurate. And part of the problem is that what we really need to know is the cortisol changing over time throughout the day? And so most of the tests only look at one sample, and really you need to do 4 or 5 in the day at different times of the day. And that'll give you a better indication of what's going on in the body. So some of the tests, and what I'm going to talk about, not all the studies did it that way. And so often they would just do 2 tests. And that might not be enough to give us the information. But here's the basics. Secure people have appropriate cortisol rises and falls, and the body feels safe, and then you can return to a calm baseline level. Anxious avoidants tend to have a hyperactive sympathetic nervous system. So they may ruminate, overanalyze things, be in emotional distress, and we'll see spikes of cortisol happening because they're in constant alert. Now, here's an interesting piece in one of the studies I saw, that men this pattern tends to be true for men. And particularly they'll have cortisol spikes at night, so they have trouble sleeping. Whereas women actually have cortisol dips happening. Generally, your cortisol is going to go down in the evening, hopefully, which helps you sleep. But their cortisol goes way down. So they have a big dip. This was a particular study. It's kind of interesting if that is the case, the differences, and probably it's mediated by different hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. But no one's really looked into this as far as I can tell. Avoidantly attached people tend to suppress their immune or stress response. So they'll appear calm, but generally their cortisol is also elevated. The theories suggest that this may actually be a freeze response that's happening, as opposed to that they're calm. And that kind of makes sense. And then the disorganized people, there's complete volatility that happens in the system. So there's highs, there's lows, and so forth. I think what's important to recognize is that attachment patterns shape how your brain interprets what is or isn't safe, particularly as it relates to relationships, right? And I think that an avoidant person might have a work relationship that isn't particularly intimate, but they won't have a cortisol response in that relationship. Whereas if they become romantically involved with someone, their cortisol might be spiking at different times, and they're not even noticing it, which is kind of interesting. This shows up, and this is the important thing to kind of recognize, that when we get this chronic dysregulation of the stress response, this is when we start to see health problems that show up. And there's a growing body of research that suggests that there is a wide variety of chronic conditions that are related to sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system being out of balance. And the sympathetic is the gas, the parasympathetic is the brakes. You cannot heal if you're in the sympathetic state, if your cortisol levels are, if you're amped up, if you're in fight flight. It is impossible to heal. And oftentimes, I believe this is why people feel tired when they start a lot of these treatments. They start to feel worse. It's not that they're feeling worse, they're just slowing down. And that's when the healing can occur. And it's something that people complain to me about because they're like, well, I got to go work, or I got to take care of the family, or whatever it is. But you got to slow down. That's when the body can relax. In terms of chronic dysregulation, symptoms that you might see: PTSD symptoms, anxiety, depression, digestive issues, immune system spiking or suppression, sleep disruption, chronic pain and inflammation. There's actually an interesting thing that I have been looking into is how mast cell reactive system, MCAS, mast cell activation system, which is basically you can have massive histamine release happen. You'll get outbreaks all over your skin, blotchiness or hives. You react to foods, pretty much every food that you eat, and so forth. All of this can happen as a result of a misregulated parasympathetic system. And the treatment involves vagal nerve stimulation, because the vagus nerve, which is part of the brainstem, helps calm everything down. What's interesting is that the vagus nerve goes into pretty much every system in the body. I mean, there's branches of it that show up everywhere, which is kind of amazing. So cortisol is a big piece of this. And by the way, if you have a reaction like that and you go to the hospital, let's say you're having a hives reaction, they'll give you cortisol or cortisone. And it's to suppress things and bring things down. And sometimes it's needed, right? Because it can be very, very uncomfortable. But ultimately, it's not going to solve the problem. And that's the important thing to recognize. Finally, what I just want to talk about is some of the ways that you can heal the attachment style if you're having an issue, if you've tried to do something, in terms of therapy and so forth, counseling. And counseling can be very helpful, but you would want to do either like an EMDR or an attachment-based therapy or somatic experiencing, something that will help retrain the patterns in the system. And I think that a lot of people just assume that it's their destiny, that, oh, I'm anxious or I'm avoidant. And it's not. You can change how you respond in these situations. Lens neurofeedback, which I do in my office in Honolulu, that actually can help regulate the brain activity. And as a result of that, people find that they're calmer. And even if you are still kind of avoidant, there's a delay, if you will. So you won't just sort of react and be like, oh, I want to run away. You'll be like, oh, I'm feeling that. Okay, I don't have to listen to that. And that's where neurofeedback can be really helpful for people. Mind-body practices are really important for this: breath work, yoga, some kind of vagus nerve stimulation, anything that's going to bring us back to the rest digest state. That's going to allow the repair to happen physically. And then, of course, in terms of relationships specifically, if you do couples counseling, help with sort of the insecure attachment patterns, talk about how to deal with the abandonment piece or the non-abandonment piece. One of the things you can do right now, if you're in a relationship and trying to connect with your partner, is just hug for at least 60 seconds, because that's going to help release oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. And some of the research says 20 seconds. I don't think 20 seconds is enough. I think you need at least a minute. And eye gazing is really great for this too. It also helps release oxytocin, helps bring people together. And finally, there's also the nutritional and biochemical support, which is the Walsh protocol, that can help reduce inflammation and help balance the neurotransmitters. And I think these are important as well sometimes for patients and for people to do. Because if you're pyroluric, for example, and you're just sort of inflamed and there's just oxidative stress in the body, you're not going to be able to settle down. You're not going to be able to do that 60-second hug oftentimes. And so that can help bring things down so people are calmer. That's what I got today, and I hope this was helpful for you. That's my goal, is to help share things that are the bridge between the physical, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual. And this is why I really love attachment theory, because I think it is one of those things that's highlighting that. And if you felt trapped in these situations, particularly in relationship where you're either wanting to get away or you're just always on alert, you're not broken. This was just something that either it's something you were born with and you begin to sort of understand that and bring that gift in, or you understand that it was a way that you learned to survive. This is where the workshop is going to help, because it's to help you uncover where the story is useful and how to transform that into the next stage of your growth. So, check out my workshop online, and I will talk to you next time.